This consideration is not an analysis of the American Civil War, also known as the War of Secession, between the northern states, the Union in blue, and the southern states, united in a confederation, in red. It began on April 12, 1861, and took place mainly in the South, although slavery, which was especially prevalent there, was not the cause of the Civil War. It became its symbol, which was already evident in the relationship between whites and slaves in the South. When the Civil War ended with the defeat of the Confederacy on June 23, 1865, between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers had fallen. In addition, there were probably around 60,000 civilians killed, mostly from the states of the Confederacy. No, this account deals with the Germans who fought in this war, mainly on the side of the North, that is, the Union. In addition, it tries to answer the question of why so many German immigrants volunteered for military service in America. Because among the contingents that were specifically recruited from certain immigrant communities, the largest were made up of Irish and German Americans, who together accounted for half of all foreign soldiers in the Union Army. To better understand the following events, here is a brief introduction to the history of political parties in the United States of America. Anyone who deals with this topic will notice parallels between the Democrats of the United States and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, while the more conservative Republicans of the United States have more in common with the Christian Democratic Union of Germany and the Christian Social Union. Before the Civil War in the United States, this was almost the opposite, because the Republican Party, founded in 1854 with its most prominent representative here, Abraham Lincoln, who was elected as the 16th President of the United States of America on March 4, 1861, was a party against the expansion of slavery. And it had nothing to do with the similarly named Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson, with which it is often confused, and from which the Democratic Party we know today later emerged. When the war broke out in 1861, there were already about 1.3 million residents in the United States of America who had been born in Germany, with the vast majority living in the North and only about 72,000 in the southern states. Of the German Union soldiers deployed in the war, 216,000 had been born in Germany, which accounts for about half of all foreign-born soldiers. Another 250,000 were Germans of the second or third generation. If you look at the political composition of the regiments in this war, there is a quota for each national group according to their share of the population. According to this, Republican immigrants volunteered more frequently than Democratic ones, with German immigrants making up the most willing group to serve at about 50%. Although this varied greatly depending on the state. In the state of Wisconsin, which was a little less than half the size of Germany and was mainly agricultural, with a population of only 5.8 million people, German participation was proportionally rather low. However, German involvement was particularly high in the states shown in yellow: New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Missouri in the Midwest. Keyword: Missouri. Especially in this predominantly Protestant state, with the city of St. Louis, the Catholic Irish and German immigrants who arrived in the 1840s and 1850s with their regional and later statewide networks of Catholic churches and schools, played a decisive role in ensuring that this important state did not join the Confederacy. That's how it happened. St. Louis is located near the state border with Illinois, not far from the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. It was economically oriented toward the south and had a large arsenal to equip around 30,000 men. Whoever possessed it could equip several divisions very well with it. Now, in St. Louis and its immediate surroundings, with its 170,000 inhabitants, about 60,000 Germans lived, including in the small town of Belleville, located just under 30 kilometers to the southeast. Many Union-loyal 48ers, as those immigrants were called in the United States, who had emigrated as a result of the suppression of the bourgeois democratic European revolutions of 1848 to 1849. With 90% German immigrants, Belleville was, for many years, the most German of all cities in the USA. In St. Louis itself, the Germans were in the minority, and were often persecuted and sometimes even attacked by the population, which tended to side with the South. Now, on April 14, 1861, 2 days after the war began, President Lincoln requested an additional 75,000 soldiers to reinforce the Union troops. Of these, the slave state of Missouri, which actually had relatively few slaves, was to provide 4,000 men, after which, 3 days later, the Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson, who was sympathetic to the Southern states, commented on this call as follows: illegal, unconstitutional, and revolutionary in its aims, inhuman, and devilish. He had also made it clear that the state of Missouri would not provide a single man for such an unholy crusade. However, Jackson had not counted on the Germans in Missouri and neighboring Illinois, including the many left liberals from the German Revolutionary period of 1848. They had already organized politically before Lincoln's election and had formed a Turner Battalion with 3 companies, totaling 280 men, most of whom had been trained by officers and non-commissioned officers educated in Europe. However, at first, they still lacked sufficient weapons. This continually growing German battalion saw itself as part of the regular garrison troops loyal to the Union and the Union-loyal militia units, which the governor, in turn, considered a provocation because it was against his policy. But since Jackson had also reinforced his troops, an approximate balance had formed between the two opposing camps, with a slight advantage in strength for the southern-oriented rebels, called rebels by the Union. But due to the strong regional composition of the Germans, it was secretly possible to reinforce the units so that, in a relatively short time, 4 Union-loyal German Missouri volunteer regiments could be formed, with a 5th soon to follow. The commanders chosen by the soldiers included Colonel Frank Blair in the 1st Regiment, a Union-loyal Anglo-American, here serving as Brigadier General. 400 Americans also served in this regiment. 2nd Regiment, Colonel Heinrich Bernstein from Hamburg. He had served 5 years in the Austrian army and later became an influential journalist in the USA. The 3rd Regiment was led by the former 48er, Colonel Franz Siegel, a former Baden infantry lieutenant born in Sinsheim, Baden, who would later become a general. The 4th Regiment, here is their flag. The so-called Black Hunters were under the command of Colonel Nikolaus Schuttner, who was born near Koblenz, a trained carpenter who had served 3 years in the Prussian army. And the 5th Regiment was under the command of Colonel Karl Eberhard Salomon, a former Prussian pioneer lieutenant who was born in Stemmern in the Prussian province of Saxony. In addition to the 5 volunteer infantry regiments, 5 German homeland defense regiments had also been formed in parallel, bringing the Union troops to around 10,000 men. However, they were still inadequately armed. Then, in order to arm themselves, the German regiments marched to the armory in St. Louis, which can be seen behind the monument. There, with the president's approval, they were sworn in, equipped, and legally recognized as soldiers of the Union. Faced with this now clearly superior large unit, the militias raised by Governor Jackson and inclined toward the Southern cause, as they called it, had withdrawn for maneuvers to Camp Jackson, named after the governor and set up by them in a suburb of St. Louis. However, the law only permitted such camps for 6 days. From this camp, however, Jackson had tried, without much success, to recruit more volunteers and had weapons and ammunition sent to him from the Confederate government that had meanwhile formed in the southern state of Louisiana in order to be able to attack the arsenal with them. When this became known among the Union troops and German regiments, on 10th May, 1861, the 1st to 4th German regiments, supported by a battery under Captain Franz Backhoff, a former artilleryman from Weschbach in Baden, demanded the surrender of Camp Jackson, which was no longer legal after the 6th day. The nearly 670 men who were inside surrendered immediately and were taken to the Union camp in St. Louis, but were released shortly afterward on their word of honor. Up to this point, the entire action had taken place without bloodshed, but an event was about to lead to the tragic so-called Camp Jackson Massacre, because after the prisoners were led away, only Company F was stationed at the camp gate. Led by Konstantin Blandowski, an ethnic Pole born in 1821 in Janowitz, Upper Silesia, a former member of the Foreign Legion, who was now serving as a captain. But in the meantime, a larger pro-Southern crowd had gathered, loudly protesting against the presence of the damned Dutch and Hessians, as the Germans were often called. By Hessians, they meant the regiments from Hesse-Kassel and others that had been loaned to Britain during the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1785, such as the infamous regiment led by Colonel Johann Rall. When roof tiles and stones were thrown at Blandowski's company at the camp gate, a drunk from the crowd apparently fired pistol shots, killing 2 German soldiers and wounding Blandowski in the knee. In response, Blandowski apparently gave his soldiers the order to fire, resulting in the deaths of 28 civilians, including women and children. More than 75 were wounded. But Blandowski also died of his wound on May 25th, after one of his legs had been amputated. The Camp Jackson Massacre, as it was called from then on, led to several days of riots in St. Louis, resulting in more deaths. In addition, rumors had been spread that the damned Dutch, the cowardly Hessian intermediaries, were planning to murder the old established Americans. The result was a wild hunt for anyone who looked or spoke German. Allegedly, 2 Germans were killed, and many were severely mistreated. However, while the image of the Germans among the pro-separatist population had been severely damaged by these events, the Union had achieved a decisive victory with the rescue of St. Louis, not least thanks to the Germans. Because if this important city had fallen into the hands of the Confederacy, Missouri would have remained a major flank threat throughout the entire war, which would have tied up significant Union forces. But as it was, the city and its surroundings became an ideal base for all further operations by the Northern troops to conquer all of Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the entire course of the Mississippi, from Vicksburg all the way down to New Orleans, the city on the Gulf of Mexico. I've already mentioned the hundreds of thousands of Germans on the side of the Union. They served in more than 30 purely German regiments, in independent German companies, and in several artillery batteries. Here is an incomplete list of these regiments due to time constraints, and it also doesn't address the varying quality of these volunteer troops, although, on the whole, German units had a good to very good reputation regarding their discipline and combat strength. It is also noteworthy, however, that many regiments at that time did not reach the current strength, for example, of a reinforced combat company in the 292nd Jaeger Battalion. In the following lists, I will use the original German name of the protagonist, if known, and not the one adopted in the United States of America. The first almost entirely German unit to be integrated into the Union Army was the 9th Ohio Infantry Regiment, The commander was the American Robert McCook, who fell in 1862. His adjutant was August Willich, a former Prussian artillery lieutenant born in Braunsberg, East Prussia, known in Germany as Willich. Willich later led the 32nd Indiana Infantry Regiment, 1st German, and was promoted to general. The 9th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment from Milwaukee. The commander was Colonel Friedrich Karl Salomon, who came from Strobeck near Halberstadt. Later, he became a general of the United States Volunteers, as the volunteers who were recruited during the war were called, but who were separate from both the regular army and the militia. The 20th New York Infantry Regiment, under the Swedish Colonel Ernst von Wegesack. It was recruited from the German gymnastics clubs in New York, and also called itself the United Turner Infantry Regiment. Here is their officer corps, the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The commanders were initially Colonel Max Einstein, who was from Baden-Württemberg, and later Colonel Gustav Adolf Buschbeck, who was from Koblenz. The 29th New York Infantry Regiment, also known as the Esther Rifles, or 1st German Infantry, was led by Colonel, later Brigadier General, Baron Adolf von Steinwehr, who was from Blankenburg in the Harz. The 32nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also known as Indiana's 1st German Regiment. The commander was the leader of the insurgents during the Baden Revolution, later United States General Colonel August Willich. He had emigrated to London as a communist after the failed 1848 revolution, and had joined Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels there until he came to the USA in 1853. The 41st New York Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the DeKalb Regiment. Their monument also stands on the battlefield of Gettysburg. In this decisive battle, their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Detlef von Einsiedel. Colonel Leopold von Gilsa, who was from Erfurt, led the 1st Brigade. Also deployed at Gettysburg was the 45th New York Infantry Regiment, also known as the 5th German Rifle Regiment, under Colonel Georg Karl Heinrich Wilhelm von Amsberg, who was from Hildesheim. After he had taken over a brigade, Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Dobke became regimental commander. The 52nd New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Karl Gottfried Freudenberg. The 58th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, commanded in the Battle of Gettysburg by Lieutenant Colonel August Otto. After his transfer, Captain Emil Koenig took command of the regiment. Here are 2 more officers, in Company D, 1st Lieutenant Heinrich Kern, and in Company E, Hans Beudel. The 68th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also known as the 2nd German Rifle Regiment. It was formed by the Prussian-born Colonel Robert Julius Bethge, shown here, Lieutenant Colonel Gustav von Gerber, and Major Johann Kleefisch. Then it was commanded by Colonel Gotthild von Borgy de Avernois. From 1864 on, it was led by Colonel Prince Felix Salm, a former Prussian hussar lieutenant born in Anhold, Borken District. The 74th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also called the 1st German Regiment, was formed by the former Prussian engineer, lieutenant and colonel, later Brigadier General Alexander Schimmelpfennig, who came from Bromberg, Prussian province of Posen. However, parts of the 74th Regiment had to retreat before the superior troops of the Confederate Army after suffering losses, both in the Battle of Chancellorsville from May 1st to 4th, 1863, and in Gettysburg from July 1st to 3rd, 1863, whose battlefield and museums I visited for several days, for military studies which the not necessarily German-friendly press took as an opportunity to gleefully report for an extended period about the cowardly Germans who had supposedly run away. The fact that purely American troops had also fled before the divisions of the prominent Southern general Robert Edward Lee was glossed over by the press as tactical adjustments to the front. The 75th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment was led by Colonel, later General, Heinrich Bohlen from Bremen, who died on August 22, 1862. The 78th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert von Hammerstein, and finally the 8th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, who carried this flag and called themselves the 1st German Rifles, or, after their first commander, Blenker's Rifles. Here is a part of their officer corps. I would like to go into more detail about this German regiment to illustrate how the battles often played out at that time. The 8th Regiment had been recruited by the German revolutionary Karl Schurz and was initially led by Colonel Ludwig Blenker, who was originally from Worms. Here, in a later picture, you can see him at the blue dot among the officer corps of the so-called German Division. To his left, at the red dot, is Prince Salm, and to his right, in green, is General Julius Stachel. The 8th New York Regiment was one of the first immigrant regiments to join the Union cause. In the spring of 1862, it was in the Shenandoah Valley in western Virginia. It was under the command of John Fremont, a general who was more political and strongly opposed to slavery, which made him very popular among German liberals. But when it came to his tactical abilities, the German soldiers were not sure if the inexperienced Fremont was the right man to lead them. Then, when food supplies became scarce due to supply difficulties, they began to loot farms and harass the population, reminiscent of the mercenaries of the 30 Years' War, which instantly turned the people of the Shenandoah Valley into staunch Confederates. Then, in June 1862, Fremont's army and another large Union force under the command of the Irish immigrant General James Shields slowly marched south in the Shenandoah Valley. There, in the spirit of the Prussian field, Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, they hoped to march separately and then unite to defeat the Confederate Army under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had received this nickname during the First Battle of Bull Run from General B, who had called out to his soldiers, "Look at Jackson's brigade. They're standing there like a stone wall." Now the two Union armies had a clear superiority of about 10,000 men over Jackson's army. But the Southern general did the only right thing before the Confederate armies could unite. He fought them one by one. Then on June 8th it was time. The predominantly German brigade, led by the Hungarian-born Brigadier General Julius H. Steil, encountered the Confederates in the small village of Cross Keys, Virginia. On the far left flank, shown in red at the top right of the map, was the 8th New York Regiment. This time, the optimistic regimental commander, whom his soldiers believed to be a drinker, had neglected to send out close security and reconnaissance patrols, which led to a military fiasco when the regiment, unsuspecting, advanced across this open area toward a wooded section. You can read about this in a letter from the German Sergeant August Horstmann of the 8th Infantry Regiment. Singing as they went, into the distance and with bayonets fixed, they moved uphill and over 3 rows of chevaux de frise until they reached the last fence on the other side of the hill. But there in the woods, 3 enemy regiments were hidden, and when the Germans were still 50 meters away, they opened fire. What must those 3 regiments have thought when they saw a single regiment marching toward them, with fixed bayonets and singing at the same time? A Confederate soldier from the Alabama Regiment stationed there witnessed the Union fiasco. They advanced with such precision, keeping in step, and their alignment was so good that it led to discussions among our officers afterward. But the poor fellows had no idea what was waiting for them behind the fence. There we were, 1,300 men, like a king tiger crouching down and ready to pounce on its unsuspecting prey. everyone in deadly silence, eyes fixed on the advancing enemy and just waiting for the order to fire. They had come as close as 50 meters when the order to fire was given to us. Many had loaded at least 4 bullets into their muskets. When the first volley was fired, there must have been up to 5,000 bullets shot at the shocked Germans. The Germans we called the Yankee Dutchmen. And the Confederate General Isaac Trimble later reported to his superiors in Richmond that the famous 8th New York Regiment, whose bravery deserved a better fate, was completely torn to pieces. The regiment had 80 killed, 2 officers and 105 men were wounded, and 31 were missing. That meant that from the 8th New York Regiment, which had marched out singing the hiking song and then fell into an ambush, 218 soldiers were lost, about half of the regiment. With the loss of so many men, New York's Little Germany in Manhattan was also severely affected. The end for this German enclave in New York came on June 15, 1904, when the paddle steamer General Slocum caught fire and sank on the New York East River. In what was, until September 11, 2001, the greatest disaster in the United States, out of 1,342, passengers 1,021 lost their lives, almost all of them German Americans, who were buried in a mass funeral. Some of the regiments I just mentioned had been part of the 11th German Army Corps. It was divided into the Mountain Army, led by the more political Major General John Charles Fremont, and the German Blenker Division under Ludwig Blenker, who was born in 1812 in Worms and promoted to colonel, later to brigadier general in the United States of America. The Blenker Division had originated from his brigade and eventually numbered around 10,000 men, which made it the strongest German unit in the entire Union Army. Here is their officer corps, Blue Dot General Blenker. The Army Corps consisted of 3 brigades, each with 3 to 4 regiments and 4 independent batteries, led by the German battery commanders. Captain, later Colonel Ludwig Schirmer, who had received his artillery training in the Prussian army, Michael Wiedrich from Hochweiler in Alsace, Emil Sturmfels, who was later promoted to colonel, and Hubert Dilger from the Black Forest. Dilger was one of 40 Germans who were awarded the highest honor on the Union side, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Dilger was considered the best artilleryman in the entire Union Army, and his battery enjoyed a legendary reputation. As for the 11th Corps, which from April 1863 was briefly commanded by United States General Oliver Otis Howard, it had received particularly bad press after the Battle of Chancellorsville, since people wanted to blame the Corps for the defeat against Stonewall Jackson. And even after Gettysburg, in July 1863, the responsible Union General, Francis Channing Barlow, once again only criticized the German units. Dutch cowards had run away again. The Dutch cowards had fled again. In contrast, the commander of the artillery of the Army of the Potomac, which was after all the largest unit in the entire Union Army and into which the 11th Corps was integrated, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, wrote that the fighting had been stubborn and bloody, and the battles persistent. And in a Confederate Gazette, it was reported that the Germans stood firm until we came close to them. Then they withdrew in an orderly fashion, firing at us as they did so. It was difficult to drive them back, much harder than we had imagined. Their officers had encouraged their men and acted like heroes themselves. Among the German soldiers in the Union Army, most came from the south and southwest of Germany. There were Baden, Rhenish-Palatinate, Swabian, and Bavarian companies. Prussian and Bavarian uniforms could be seen. The command language was exclusively German. Most of the officers were also Germans. Some of them were professional officers who had emigrated out of a sense of adventure, or those who had been politically active in what was then considered the wrong direction and had been dismissed from the army. There were young men with gambling debts or so-called inappropriate love affairs with consequences. The reasons had been as varied as life itself. But many of these former German soldiers had a particularly hard time in America. Often disappointed by civilian life and not particularly successful, they had joined the army full of hope, only to be disappointed there as well. It is true that a considerable number of earlier immigrants had risen to high positions. 7 of the former officers of the Baden-Palatinate Revolutionary Army of 1848 alone had already been appointed generals in the Union Army during the first year of the war. Like Max Weber, who was born in Aachen, but the later immigrants were less fortunate. Added to this was the German bad habit of nagging discord that was brought to America. This also contributed to the fact that many German officers, especially those trained at the West Point Military Academy and who filled most of the middle and upper leadership positions in the regular Union troops, were looked at askance. By the end of the war, in 1865, nearly half of the German officers had fallen, or had been wounded to the point of being unfit for service. Some had also died a cruel death in one of the overcrowded prison camps of the Confederate Army. In particular, the images of Andersonville Camp in Georgia are reminiscent of the unbelievable conditions in the German Rheinwiesen camps from April to September 1945. As for the military quality of all militia and volunteer units of the Union, at least until the Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, they had been nothing more than armed mobs, made up of willing and newly American patriotic volunteers, who had enlisted in large numbers at the beginning of the war, but of whom very few had actually been soldiers in their old homeland. The volunteers then had to fight, after a short training, or sometimes none at all, under inexperienced officers who, after a long civilian life, had become unaccustomed to the art of war, or were simply dubious adventurers. Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke characterized it this way: in the American Civil War, mob fights against mob, although the Germans could not be excluded from this either. However, one question has not yet been answered. Why did so many Germans volunteer on the side of the North? A brief look at history is enough to answer this. A few weeks after Lincoln's election on March 4, 1861, the Southern states shown in red began to leave the Union. However, the secessionist movement had already begun before he took office, around Christmas of 1860. Lincoln, the representative of the Republican Party founded 4 years earlier, had already recognized the danger to the existence of the United States several months before his election, and communicated his view that secession should be seen as part of a strategy by Southern politicians to use the threat of violence to achieve what they could not win at the ballot box, in order, as he put it, to bring an end to democracy in the United States. And at first, many German immigrants, by the way, just like the majority of the Irish in the turbulent elections of the 1850s, still voted for the Democrats during the rhetorical confrontation between Lincoln and his Republican rival from Illinois, the politically moderate lawyer Stephen Arnold Douglas. They gradually turned to the Republican Lincoln. An important reason for this was the resistance of many liberal Germans to the expansion of slavery. German-language newspapers in America and campaign speeches by radical German immigrant lawyer Karl Schurz greatly influenced this change in sentiment. He immigrated to the United States from Erftstadt Liebla in 1852 and, like many Germans, became a Freemason. When Lincoln took office as president, he was briefly appointed ambassador to Spain, and from 1877 to 1881 under the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, he even served as Secretary of the Interior of the United States. During the Civil War starting in 1861, Schurz, who had no prior military service, was appointed Major General and Division Commander in the 11th, the German Corps. But it was not only the influence of newspapers and speeches, for example by Schurz, that had influenced the German immigrants, because at first they had split their votes between Lincoln and Douglas. But they were also angered by the behavior of the southern states, which many of them saw as a coup by southern aristocrats that would destroy the American Republic. They had seen parallels to the democratic movements in the German states that were crushed by the military in 1848, which had ended their democratic dream. Now they had heard about the shelling of Fort Sumter in North Carolina by Confederate artillery on April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, which also marked the beginning of the Civil War. As a result, the former leader of the insurgents during the Baden Revolution, who had emigrated in 1853 and later became a general in the Union Army during the Civil War, August von Willich, who came from East Prussia, and had already been mentioned as the commander of the 32nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment, demanded that the Germans must protect their new Republican homeland from the aristocracy of the South. It was also helpful for Abraham Lincoln, who had especially courted the Germans to join the Union regiments, that they were disproportionately opposed to slavery. Thus, as early as the 1850s, they had already founded their own so-called abolitionist societies, supported by the German-language press. But the German immigrants had not felt attracted to the much broader abolitionist movement of the Anglo-Saxons, because it was too closely intertwined with the Protestant Puritanism of the New England states, which the Germans considered to be bigoted toward immigrants, Catholics, and liberals. Because this group of American-born clerical abolitionists, as the supporters of the movement to abolish slavery were called, after the English word abolition from the Latin abolitio, meaning abolition, had always promoted their idea in a lecturing, almost arrogant tone and demanded a strict ban on alcohol. They wanted to ban the singing societies, which were especially popular among the Germans, as well as any kind of concerts and dance events on the Sabbath. So, in other words, everything that was an important part of the community life of German immigrants. It was this fanatically militant Protestant tone in public life, which accompanied the abolition of slavery, that had repeatedly provoked protests from Germans. But despite their resistance to the American abolitionists, the Germans continued to be staunch supporters of the anti-slavery movement. Many immigrants who, for example, joined German regiments in New York shortly after the end of the war, saw themselves as the freest and most industrious people of the North, who wanted to fight against the lazy and arrogant Junker spirit of the South, although surely none of them had ever personally met a resident of the southern states in peacetime. Added to this was the very German claim that only the work ethic brought by the immigrants would redeem America. In contrast, its native sons would not always appreciate their freedoms and opportunities. However, this was a view that had also been expressed by the Irish and other immigrant groups. Many of the Germans, however, had also volunteered to express their gratitude to America, even though they considered the country to be deeply flawed. There are countless letters from German Union soldiers in the archives in which they complained about mistreatment and prejudice, but in the next sentence expressed their deep affection for America. For example, Sergeant Albert Krauss, who was strictly opposed to slavery, wrote to his family in Germany about the pride he felt. "The United States has taken me in. I earn my living here. Why shouldn't I defend it with my flesh and blood? Well, I wish at least some of the people who were allowed into Germany after 2015 were just as grateful to their host country." As for the German immigrants to the United States of America, of course not all of them were as patriotic as Sergeant Krauss, but they still volunteered, like the infantryman here in the 8th New York Regiment German Rifles, next to the pioneer from the 20th New York Infantry Regiment, United Turner Sharpshooters. also hoping their service would finally end discrimination, especially against German immigrants. But beyond that, they were also driven by another concern. They, who now lived in a very large united country on a very large continent, had, in Germany before the founding of the German Empire in January 1871, lived in one of the four monarchies, the kingdoms of Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg-Baden, as well as dozens of other smaller states. Now, in still united America, many German immigrants feared that if the South succeeded, the United States could also split into smaller states, which would mean they had gone from the German frying pan into the American fire. A divided America, in their view, would be powerless to advance democratic movements in the world. So, while many Germans had joined the army for strongly ideological or moral reasons, there were also those who did so for purely personal reasons. For example, a young soldier who had emigrated to the United States of America without his parents' permission, using money stolen from his father, wrote home that his goal was now to become a man by becoming a soldier. Then he assured his father that, with God's help, his path was destined for glory. And finally, there was also the group that had been shanghaied into the army with a cash incentive. For example, a Wilhelm Albrecht, who had immigrated to the United States of America shortly after the start of the war, reported in a letter to Germany that he first landed in Castle Garden, the first American immigration station before Ellis Island, where more than 7.5 million people arrived between 1855 and 1890. As soon as you came ashore, recruiters rushed at you from all sides. Since I didn't know anything about American recruitment tricks, I did the same as the others. I signed. Albrecht was then assigned to an American unit, but shortly afterward he deserted and instead joined the German 1st Battalion of the Light New York Artillery. The last look is at the German soldiers in the Confederate Army, which was about 1,080,000 men strong, with the numbers ranging between 3,500 and 7,000. But this number also includes the drafted non-volunteer Germans, many of whom deserted. The only Confederate German regiment was the 20th Louisiana Infantry Regiment, formed in New Orleans, with 5 German companies. The commander was Major, later Colonel, August Reichert, who was originally from Minden. However, many of his soldiers had defected to the Union troops when New Orleans fell into Union hands in May 1862. These desertions had led to great mistrust toward the Germans and, between 1862 and 1864, to the unjustified imprisonment of 384 Germans in the southern capital, Richmond, likely also due to the high participation of Germans on the side of the Union. Only one of the officers born in Germany had been appointed as a general in the Confederate Army. Johann Andreas Wagner, who was born in Severn, east of Bremerhaven, and who had commanded the 1st South Carolina Artillery Regiment as a colonel. Then there was Colonel Adolf Hyman, who was born in Potsdam, who first led the 10th Tennessee Infantry Regiment and later commanded a brigade as a general. He was then taken prisoner, released after 6 months, and died shortly thereafter. Another was Colonel August Karl Buell, who came from Guntersblum in Rhenish Hesse and was commander of the 1st Texas Cavalry. Buell died on April 15, 1864, after suffering a severe wound in the Battle of Pleasant Hill in Louisiana, and was subsequently honored with a state funeral. The most prominent German officer in the Confederate Army was Lieutenant Colonel Heros von Borke, born at the Ehrenbreitstein Fortress in Koblenz. The former Prussian cavalry officer, famous throughout the Southern Army for his bravery and boldness, later became the closest confidant, adjutant, and chief of staff to Confederate Major General James Ewell Brown Stewart. In 1866, von Borke returned to Prussia to fight as a major in the Prussian Neumärkisches Dragoon, Regiment No. 3 in the Austro-Prussian War. Finally, looking at the units of German soldiers on both the Union and Confederate sides, all suffered significant losses in this fratricidal war, but they were also able to distinguish themselves time and again. Especially the German involvement on the side of the victorious Union was recognized for decades until during World War I, Anglo-Saxon propaganda turned the Germans into Huns and bloodthirsty beasts, which dramatically pushed back German influence, particularly in the United States of America. But it is also an undeniable fact that the American Civil War damaged the soul of the United States of America so deeply that its consequences have not been overcome to this day.